Hello, welcome to Ausbiz Asia. I'm Sarah Clark. Coming up, we meet the Australian golf course designers who carved a solid slice of the action in Asia. And the media and communications duo who've set up their own successful agencies in Hong Kong and over 20 years have got a network that would make many green with envy. Between the two of you, you both seem to know the whole of Hong Kong. Is that part of the job?
Yes, I know one half, she knows the other.
I've been called Google on legs before, and I did take that as a bit of a compliment, yes.
And what are the biggest financial landmines that expats often overlook when taking the big leap overseas? Moving overseas into a new job can be overwhelming, albeit an exciting time. But so often, getting your bookkeeping in order is overlooked. And for expatriates, the key is to avoid neglecting your finances by keeping your investment and superannuation portfolios in order before you take the big leap. Brett Evans lived in Asia for 11 years and now runs his own financial and investment company, advising Australian expats on those potential landmines. Brett Evans, thanks very much for joining the program. Now let's start with you. You're an expat and you work for a number of blue chip finance operators. Why did you go out and start your own company?
I guess due to my background of being an expat, when I went back to Australia to work in the financial services industry, by default I used to always get questions from colleagues and friends that are still in Hong Kong or greater parts of Asia about their finances, and as time went by and legislation changed and I guess managing finances became harder and harder, more and more questions started to come our way, and that's when we realised that there is a value in having a dedicated service offering to Australian expats. We're the first in Australia to do it, and I think judging by the amount of questions and feedback and commentary I've had in the last couple of years, we're only just sort of scratching the surface anyway. So,
which region across Asia do you have most of your expat clients?
I'd say primarily Singapore, Hong Kong and China. China's probably the biggest growing market for us right now. It blows me away how many Australians are moving to China every week. People talk about the demands of China. I actually think it's only getting bigger. The changes happening in China right now, I guess the demographics of the Aussie expat, typically in Hong Kong or Singapore, would have been either airlines, financial services, legal services. You go to Shanghai now, and I'm dealing with landscape designers, people just, even social media guys, very different skill sets. So I actually think the Chinese market has now opened the doors to a lot more Australians to become an expat in different categories.
Before Australians do make that big decision to move abroad, what are some of the key financial decisions that you think need to be addressed before people take the big leap?
I think getting tax advice is probably the main thing. Tax laws regarding non-residents are getting more and more strict, and the ATO has been apologetic in the fact that they are targeting non-residents. So I think having a briefing done by a qualified accountant who has experience in dealing with expats and non-resident issues is probably the most important thing. Set things up before you go, whether it be savings plans, looking at reviewing your super, all these types of issues. By doing that early, when you get overseas, it's already been done. A lot of people do or don't realise that you actually have life insurance and TPD insurance inside your superannuation. Speak to your super provider, see whether they cover you as an expat. Some don't. That's very important. Usually people don't realise these things until it's too late, and they go to make that phone call to the insurer or to the super provider, and they find out that there's actually exclusions excluding them while they've been overseas.
The federal government's made some recent changes to superannuation rules, as well as potentially investing tax-free in the Australian property market. What's your advice here?
I wouldn't call it quite a fad in Australia right now, but the property brokers are really getting hold of this. The fact that you can borrow in super now to buy a property. From an expat point of view, you can only do that type of investment through a self-managed super fund, and generally speaking, expats can't actually have a self-managed super fund because it does not meet the control test. So from a non-residents point of view, they're pretty much defined to some sort of retail or industry super fund environment for the time being anyway.
How often are you dealing with expats who are caught up in offshore savings and investment bonds being marketed by so-called financial advisors?
Too often, it would be the honest question. There are good and bad financial advisors offshore, and there are sometimes good reasons for investing in these bonds offshore, but the devil's in the detail and the disclosure. You know, if you're disclosed up front what the fees are, what the handcuffs are like in terms of when you can and can't get your money out, and if you go into these investments fully informed, then there is no problem. It's when people go into these investments thinking that it's a short-term investment and they go to try and redeem some of their money, you know, after a couple of years to find out they're actually locked in for 10 years. That's when, unfortunately, people come to us. By then it's too late. And I've seen penalty fees up to 76% of the value of the investment by only exiting after 5 years.
Looking at tax, how often do you come across a situation where an expat thinks that they're no longer a permanent resident and they're paying a low tax in a country in Asia, but they then get a call from the ATO?
Quite often, to tell you the truth. And I think there's a lot of urban myths or you know, sort of over-the-back fence type banter when it comes to tax advice, unfortunately, amongst expats. And they'll go down to a bar and have a drink with a guy and he'll tell them his interpretation of the tax law, and then he'll go off and just believe that as gospel. Definitely, and that's one of the reasons why we say to clients before you go, have that tax brief by an accountant before you leave, because otherwise it can be a very expensive mistake.
You now live in Australia and you're settled there. Do you miss living abroad?
Definitely miss Hong Kong. Both my wife and I are from Hong Kong originally, and you know, we've always sort of considered this as a second home. So coming back here, it's, you know, it's just like putting on an old suit. You know, it just sort of fits well. So definitely.
Brett Evans, thank you very much for joining the program.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks for watching stories about Australians doing business in Asia.